He handed his wife the divorce papers at 7 in the morning, and she took them the same way she took everything. Quietly, without flinching, like she had already calculated exactly what that envelope weighed and had decided it was manageable. What Kirk Reeves did not know, what he could not have known because he had stopped paying attention years ago, was that Mara Sutton had been managing things he couldn't see for a very long time. And in approximately 6 hours, the rest of the country was going to find out. Before we go any further, if you believe that what you build in silence eventually speaks louder than the event you were told you couldn't do, subscribe to Crimson Secrets, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's see how far this story travels. The alarm had gone off at 5:15. Mara had been waking up at 5:15 for 4 years, not because anyone made her, but because the hour before sunrise was the one part of the day that belonged entirely to her. No meetings, no noise from the upstairs neighbors, no sound of Kirk's television bleeding through the wall from the guest room, where he had been sleeping for the better part of 11 months. She stood at the kitchen window of their Evanston townhouse with a cup of black coffee and watched the sky, above Lake Michigan, go from charcoal to gray to the first thin line of pale gold. Chicago waking up. January light. The kind that made everything look like a photograph before anyone had time to ruin it. Today was the day. She had known it for 3 months, since the letter arrived from the National Architecture and Infrastructure Foundation announcing that she had been selected as the recipient of the Meridian Award, given once every 2 years to the engineer or architect whose work had most significantly advanced American public infrastructure. She had read the letter in her car in a parking garage at 11 at night, because that was the kind of hour she kept, and she had sat there for 4 full minutes doing nothing at all before she typed a single text to Tobias Park. They said yes. His response came back in under 30 seconds. I already knew they would. The question was always when. She had not told Kirk, not then, not after. She told herself it was because he wouldn't understand the significance. But that wasn't entirely true. She knew by then that there were things she had stopped telling Kirk, not because he wouldn't understand, but because his not understanding had become, after 4 years, a kind of chronic, low-grade wound she had learned to keep clean and covered and away from air. She heard his footsteps at 7. Heavy, deliberate. The walk of a man who had decided something and was moving toward it before he could change his mind. She didn't turn around. Mara. His voice was flat in a way she recognized, rehearsed like he'd run through this in the mirror. I need you to see something. She took a slow sip of coffee. I'm getting ready. This can't wait. She turned. He was standing in the doorway in his running clothes, holding a manila envelope with both hands. Not extended toward her, held tight, like he was reminding himself not to let go of his conviction. She looked at the envelope. She looked at him. What is that, Kirk? He set it on the kitchen island and slid it 2 inches in her direction. Divorce papers. I had them drawn up 3 weeks ago. A pause. I wanted to be sure before I did anything. Mara looked at the envelope. She was a structural engineer by training and an architect by practice, and she understood something about load-bearing systems that most people didn't, that it wasn't the dramatic failures you had to worry about. It was the slow accumulation of stress over time, the way a joint could hold for years and years before the metal finally said enough. She had watched her marriage the same way. She had known the load was too much for the structure. She had known for a while. Today, she said, not a question. I know the timing. Today, she said it again evenly. You're giving me divorce papers on the morning of the Meridian Award. Kirk's jaw tightened. I didn't know when the ceremony was. It's been on the refrigerator for 6 weeks. He said nothing. She picked up the envelope, held it with both hands. She thought about 4 years of coming home at midnight. 4 years of grant applications and federal review boards and 72-hour deadlines that Kirk had learned to navigate around with the careful choreography of a man who had accepted that his wife was somewhere else. She thought about the last dinner party they had attended together, where someone had asked her what she did, and Kirk had answered, before she could, saying something vague about design work, like the specifics weren't worth the airtime. She thought about the text from Tobias this morning. Signing is at 2. Walsh confirmed his full team will be there. You ready? She put the envelope on the counter. Okay, she said. Kirk blinked. Okay? I'll sign. She looked at him steadily. I have a ceremony at noon and a meeting at 2. I'll deal with the papers this evening. He seemed to have expected more. She could see it in the way he recalibrated, the slight deflation of someone who had braced for impact and found nothing to push against. The house, he said. We'd need to talk about the house and the finances. Mara, you haven't had a stable income in 4 years. Kirk, she said his name quietly. I'm just saying, you should probably start thinking about. I need to finish getting ready. She walked to the bedroom and closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed for 2 minutes. She allowed herself exactly that. She thought about the early years, when Kirk had called her work important, when he had come to her presentations, when he had kept a folder on his phone of articles she'd been mentioned in, and showed them to people at bars, like she was something he was proud of. She thought about when that stopped. She thought about the slow erosion of small things, the questions that weren't asked, the invitations that weren't extended. The particular loneliness of sleeping next to someone who had decided you were less than you actually were. 2 minutes. Then she stood, opened the closet, and took out the dress she had hung there 3 days ago, for exactly this occasion. Navy, structured, the kind of thing that read as serious without trying to announce itself. Kirk was in the kitchen when she walked out, pouring himself coffee with the ease of a man who had already, emotionally, relocated. I can have my things out by the weekend, he said, without looking up. Cleo's place has more room anyway. Mara stopped. Cleo. He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She had suspected. She hadn't let herself confirm it because confirmation would have required energy she didn't have for something she couldn't fix. But she filed it away now. The name. The implication. The 4 years of her working until midnight, while Kirk was apparently building something of his own. Have a good day, Kirk, she said. She picked up her bag and the manila envelope and her keys, and she walked out. If you have ever walked into a room knowing something that no one else in the room knows yet, you understand something about the way Mara moved through the Meridian Award ceremony that afternoon. The event was held at the Chicago Cultural Center, in the building's grand rotunda, beneath its vaulted Tiffany glass ceiling, a room that had the particular acoustics of a space that expected important things to be said in it. 500 people in formal attire, the kind of crowd where 3/4 of the guests knew each other by professional reputation before they ever shook hands. Mara arrived alone. She had been offered a +1. She hadn't used it. She sat in the 3rd row and watched the program unfold, and thought not about Kirk, not about the divorce papers in her bag, but about the project. 4 years ago, she and Tobias Park had quietly incorporated a firm called Lattice Infrastructure under a Delaware LLC, using her premarital savings, a small business loan, and a federal innovation grant awarded solely in her name before the marriage. She had chosen the name deliberately. A lattice, the kind of structure that distributes load not through a single strong member, but through a network, each piece bearing its share. She had always liked what that implied. They had spent 2 years building something the architecture world was not yet ready to hear about. A proprietary structural modeling system, she called it the lattice method, that reduced the material cost of major bridge and transit rehabilitation projects by up to 31% without compromising safety ratings. She had published the foundational mathematics in a peer-reviewed journal 8 months ago, under her maiden name. The paper had received 4 citations in the first month, then 40. Then, after a quiet email from a researcher at the Army Corps of Engineers, a request for a meeting. That meeting had led to a second meeting, and a third, and eventually to a room in Washington, D.C., where a federal transportation official named Glenn Walsh had looked at her data for 45 minutes in complete silence and then said, "We've been looking for something exactly like this for 11 years. The contract, a 7-year federal engagement to apply the lattice method to the rehabilitation of 42 structurally deficient bridges across the Midwest, was worth $940 million. The signing was scheduled for 2 o'clock this afternoon. Kirk had handed her divorce papers at 7 this morning. When the Foundation's president called her name Mara Sutton for sustained excellence in public infrastructure engineering and the development of structural systems that will define the next generation of American public works. She walked to the podium and shook his hand and looked out at 500 faces and thought about the moment 4 months ago when she had run the lattice method's stress simulations for the 42nd time and the numbers had come back exactly right, and she had sat alone in her office at 11 at night and understood with complete certainty that it was going to work. She accepted the award. She spoke for 3 minutes, precisely. She thanked Tobias. She thanked 2 professors from her doctoral program whose names Kirk had heard so many times he had stopped registering them. She said nothing about the contract. She said nothing about the divorce papers. She said, "The structures that last are the ones built on honest math. Everything else eventually gives way." She stepped down from the podium. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. "Walsh is already here, lobby of the federal building. He brought 6 people. Mara, this is actually happening." She typed back, "Be there in 20 minutes." The federal conference room on the 14th floor of the Dirksen building had the same quality all such rooms have, fluorescent lit, windowless, designed to make everyone in it feel slightly like they were taking a test. Glenn Walsh was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, with the posture of someone who had spent 30 years reviewing documents for the kind of mistakes that cost cities money. He stood when Mara walked in. "Dr. Sutton," he extended a hand. "I understand this morning was significant on other counts as well." She shook his hand, the Meridian Award. "I know about the award," he said, with something that might have been a smile if he'd let it develop fully. "Congratulations. Deserved." He sat. "I was referring to the other thing." She looked at him steadily. "My wife practices family law," he said simply. "She mentioned your name came across a filing this morning." Mara held his gaze for exactly 1 second, then, "The signing first, Mr. Walsh. Everything else can wait." He almost smiled again. "I like how you think." The signing took 50 minutes. $940 million, distributed over 7 years, applied to 42 bridges, with the lattice method licensed exclusively to lattice infrastructure for the duration of the engagement. Mara initialed every page herself. She had read the full contract twice, once 3 weeks ago, once at 4:30 this morning over black coffee while the city was still dark. When the last page was countersigned and the bound copies stacked between legal teams, Walsh looked across the table at her. "How does it feel?" She thought about 7 in the morning. The manila envelope. "You haven't had a stable income in 4 years." "It feels like what happens," she said carefully, "when you do the math right." She called Tobias from the parking garage. He answered on the first ring. "Tell me," she said. "We just closed a $940 million federal contract." His voice was controlled in the specific way of a person about to lose that control entirely. "Mara." "I know. We did this. We did this." A pause. "How are you, actually? Because you signed divorce papers this morning, which I have been sitting on all day, and I need to know you're not just." "I'm all right," she said. "Tobias, what's our retained equity position?" He exhaled long and slow. "You are the most professionally composed human being I have ever met in my entire career." The equity. 12% retained, plus the base fee structure, plus the research division stays under our direct control for the full 7 years. She did the math as she walked to her car. 12% of a $940 million federal engagement, plus what the lattice methods commercial licensing would generate in the private sector once the federal contract made the methodology public record. She had done this math before, many times. In the pre-dawn mornings, when the coffee was still too hot and the city was still dark, and she was still technically married to a man who thought she was struggling to stay afloat. She had never been struggling, not in the way he thought. She got in her car, she sat for a moment. Then she opened her phone and found the contact for Monica Vreeland, who had been practicing family law in Chicago for 19 years, and who had, 8 months ago, agreed to a brief consultation. When Mara had asked, calmly, without apparent emotion, to understand her position under Illinois equitable distribution law in the event of a divorce. She had not told Kirk she had done this. She had not told anyone. She had simply wanted to understand the terrain. It was how she approached everything. Monica picked up on the second ring. I heard the news, both of them. Mara paused. Which reached you first? The federal contract 90 minutes ago. Kirk's filing around noon. A beat. Mara, the timing? I know. Lattice Infrastructure was incorporated during the marriage, 26 months ago. Under Illinois law, that company is a marital asset. The filing Kirk submitted today is a petition, not a decree. There's a mandatory waiting period. The contract was executed this afternoon while the marriage remains legally intact. Mara leaned her head back against the headrest. She looked at the concrete ceiling of the parking structure. She had not engineered this. She had not known. Kirk was going to hand her papers this morning. She had not moved the signing date. The timing had simply been what it was. The natural collision of a man who moved too late, and a woman who had been building too quietly for him to see the structure going up. But she understood what it meant. I want you to look at the filing carefully, Mara said, before his attorney does. Already looking, Monica said. Kirk called 4 times that evening. She listened to the first voicemail. His voice was different than it had been. At 7 that morning, the rehearsed flatness was gone. Something rougher, faster. He had heard something. She could tell. The Federal Register announcement had found him through the particular velocity of a city where everyone knows someone who knows something, and what he was hearing was rewriting everything. He thought he understood about what he had walked away from that morning. She deleted the voicemail. The settlement conversation came 12 days later. Kirk's attorney opened, with a demand for 30% of Lattice Infrastructure's projected valuation, on the grounds that Mara had built the company using time that belonged to the marriage. Monica's response, as she later described it, was brief. Mr. Reeves contributed 0 capital, 0 intellectual property, and 0 documented labor to Lattice Infrastructure. The foundational methodology predates the marriage by 18 months. If your client wants to argue before an Illinois judge that his wife's mind was a marital asset he's owed compensation for, we will see how that reads in the public record. Kirk folded in 9 days, clean dissolution. No asset claims against Lattice. He kept his personal accounts and his car. Mara kept everything else. She moved into a rental with high ceilings and a view of the lake and set up her drafting desk in front of the window the first afternoon. It was the first room she had ever furnished entirely for herself, with no negotiation, no compromise, no quiet shrinking to accommodate someone else's certainty about what a room should feel like. She stood at the desk and put her hands flat on the surface and thought, this is what it feels like to take up the exact amount of space you actually need. 3 months later, a reporter called for a profile piece. At the end, she asked, your husband filed for divorce the morning you signed the federal contract. Did you see it coming? Mara was quiet for a moment. I knew the structure wasn't holding, she said. I could read the load. I just didn't know when it would give. And when it did? I did what engineers do, she said. I built something better. The first bridge in the Lattice Infrastructure Rehabilitation Program was the Milburn Street Overpass in East Chicago. A 47-year-old structure crossing a rail yard, used daily by 11,000 cars, serving a neighborhood that had waited 19 years for the city to address the failing supports. Mara drove out to see the groundbreaking on a Tuesday morning in February. She stood on the sidewalk with Tobias and watched the crew set up and said nothing for a long time. A woman came out of the diner across the street and stood on the steps, watching. She was maybe 60, coat too thin for the cold, and she looked at the construction with the expression of someone who had been told something would happen for so long that they had stopped entirely believing it would. She looked at Mara. Is this actually going to happen this time? Yes, Mara said. The woman studied her. How do you know? Because I did the math myself, Mara said. The woman nodded once, slowly, and went back inside. Tobias looked at Mara. Mara looked at the bridge. She thought about a January morning 4 years ago, when she had first written the foundational equations for what would become the lattice method on a legal pad in her kitchen at 5 in the morning, while the city was still dark, and her husband was asleep. And the idea was so precise and so audacious that she had been afraid to say it out loud for 6 full months. She thought about the 42 times she had run the stress simulations before the numbers came back clean. She thought about you haven't had a stable income in 4 years, said by a man who had been standing 3 feet away from one of the most significant infrastructure methodologies in American engineering, and had seen nothing but a woman who was always somewhere else. The crew broke the first ground. Mara Sutton watched the math become real and understood. The way she always understood things, with her whole body and no room for doubt, that the most dangerous person in any room is not the loudest one, not the most certain one, not the one who hands you an envelope at 7 in the morning with 2 fingers like a verdict. It is the one who walks out of that kitchen, drives to an award ceremony, signs a $940 million contract, and goes back to work. She was only getting started.